Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagan here with a huge week of World War III analysis. We are getting closer and closer to what you can really call the point of no return when it comes to the U.S.-Iran conflict. We are on the brink of where basically the Americans will have to concede major losses to the Iranians, or they will have to escalate with ground forces, nuclear weapons, or some other major attempt to breach the current stalemate, as Iran seems capable of taking almost unlimited American blows, and the precision of their missiles this past week has been devastating to the Americans. We're going to break down all of these targets. We're going to discuss the situation in the Bab El Mandeb, which is about to be closed just like the Strait of Hormuz, so the energy crunch is rapidly escalating. We have updates from Lebanon and Palestine, as well as major Black Sea updates as Russia is blockading Ukraine on the Black Sea. The ports in Odessa and elsewhere, and Ukraine is reciprocating on the Russians with major escalating drone strikes on Russian infrastructure, and including Russian civilian shipping and manufacturing and these other things. So we're going to be discussing all of this, the course of World War III, what is coming next, of course, church news, and a whole host of other things, fulfilled prophecies, the completion of the E65 Highway. All of this is going to be on the menu today. I'm, of course, on the road. I'm on a bit of a vacation at the beach, so I'm sorry if I'm sounding a bit different. I'm on my travel microphone, so hope everyone is enjoying their summer. Of course, we've just passed the celebration of the Royal Martyrs and the Feast of St. Elias, which, of course, many elders and eldresses said would be around the time when many of these events would be transpiring. So we're going to be discussing all of this and so much more in this upcoming episode. So before I do some plugs and dive into everything, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing amazing, Conrad. You know, it's been quite a fulfilling week in terms of most of the news which we foreshadowed, especially the unfortunate news of the US basically escalating and continuing down this ruinous path, of course, has come to pass. And we, in fact, are standing basically on the brink of the 2 weeks resumption of the conflict. The war in Eastern Europe well and truly rages on. And in fact, there are massive escalations in everything, including, of course, church persecution. So definitely listen until the end of the show, because we'll have updates on what is happening to the Orthodox Church in Ukraine and Zelensky's plan of basically continuing to attack us.
All fronts on World War III are escalating for sure. There's even been some skirmishes in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines, so we're going to be discussing all of that and more today. But before we do, I want to encourage everybody to check out worldwarnow.co if you enjoy this analysis, if you want to support the work that we do here day in, day out across all of our platforms, covering the ongoing Third World War through the lens of Orthodox Christian prophecy and rising multipolarity. Be sure to check out our Substack and get behind the paywall. We do interviews every week on our Ether Hour show with a variety of guests. Sometimes they're on guest and it's Dmitry and I answering audience questions or covering another relevant historical topic. But the episodes are perennially relevant. It's not just weekly news like we talk about here on World War Now. And this week, for example, we talked to Father Peter Heers all about the Orthodox parishioner and how the communities all around the world that are Orthodox should be responding to these upcoming events, fuel shortages, the fulfillment of these prophecies of the saints, and so much more. We get into Orthodox perspectives on psychotherapy, whether Orthodox Christians should join the military. We discuss the papism situation with the SSPX and future Orthodox councils, and so much more incredible stuff. So check that out. It will be linked down below. It'll be the latest Ether Hour episode on worldwarnow.co. So get behind the paywall. You can listen to that episode in full, as well as other recent episodes with Dr. David Patrick Harry, former Defense Minister of Lebanon, Yaqub Saraf, Dr. Matthew Raphael Johnson, Nick Griffin, former member of the European Parliament, our recent series all about Rasputin in 3 parts that we recently wrapped up, as well as our 2-part series with Gregory Hears about St. John Vatatzis. So many more incredible episodes, hundreds and hundreds of hours of content behind the paywall on Ether Hour, and you get several other perks as well, such as private Discord chats, and a whole host of other things. So check all of that out, linked down below at worldwarnow.co. If you want to support us more, if you're already a supporter there, or you want to just give us a one-time donation, check out the Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/worldwarnow. We respond to all of the donations on there as well. Be sure to check out antelopehillpublishing.com as well, the foremost publisher of dissident books currently operating, and whatever books you wish to buy, whether it's The Culture of Critique by Kevin MacDonald or Germany in Stalin's Crosshairs, their recent World War II edition and translation, be sure to check all of those out and use code WWN for 10% off at checkout, again, at antelopehillpublishing.com. It's really a great resource, and they have some incredible offerings. I've purchased many a book myself from them, so that's all linked down below. Those are the best ways you can support us. Be sure to check me out every Tuesday evening at 7:45 p.m. Central Time. I'm live. You can ask me any questions you want in the form of a super chat, so people love those shows called World War Live. I'm live on YouTube, X, and Substack, so check all of that out. But with all of that, you're here for this week's World War III analysis, and it's time that we dive right in. And of course, in the past few days, this is Friday, July 24th, the day this is being recorded, Trump has threatened to carry out his biggest attack yet on Iran. He says, I'm considering a massive attack, bigger than ever before. I'm close to making a decision. We are all set for it. He didn't elaborate on what he was planning, but he has previously threatened to launch massive strikes targeting civilian infrastructure in Iran, including bridges, power plants, and water desalination plants. Trump has also signaled that he may bomb Pickaxe Mountain, known as Kolonku, where U.S. and Israeli officials have claimed there may be underground nuclear activity. Claims Iran has denied. Israeli media reported on Wednesday that the U.S. informed Israel that it intends to escalate its attacks on Iran in the coming days and may use heavy bombers to target the mountain. Despite the U.S. being at war with Iran at the request of Israel, according to the official U.S. State Department rationale, Israel has sat out the war since the ceasefire and memorandum of understanding collapsed. Trump told Ravid of Axios that Israel would join in 2 minutes if I asked them to, but added that we don't need anybody to launch a new attack against Iran. He said that there would be consequences for Israel if it joined, appearing to reference potential Iranian retaliation against Israeli territory. So again, behind the scenes, we know, obviously last week we discussed Bezalel Smotrich saying that the current situation right now is more desirable for Israel. They don't want to enter the war with the U.S. right now, and they've made it clear that the only war that they are interested in entering into is a scorched earth, total destruction policy that targets Iranian infrastructure, leadership to topple the regime and completely take out the Iranian Islamic Republic from the region as a whole. So that is Israel's plan. Trump seems to be leaning more and more towards that idea. There seem to be several schools of thought that he might do a huge strike on Pickaxe Mountain, claim we destroyed their centrifuges again, basically a sort of rerun of Operation Midnight Hammer, claim victory and walk away. Not sure how that solves the Strait of Hormuz problem, but he'd probably figure that out. And again, that's just another kick the can down the road. Or we're going to see a major operation, ground operation on the coast, potential tactical nuclear deployments, but of course, getting Israel involved and striking all across Iranian infrastructure, bridges, power plants, and whatnot, which we know, of course, would trigger a major Iranian retaliation. And in fact, several more American troops, of course, this past week were killed in Iranian strikes. And of course, several Iranians were killed in American strikes, which are ongoing across mostly southern Iran. But the IRGC's Qatam al-Anbiya central headquarters said this week, from this moment onward, we are setting a new equation. For every Iranian martyred, an American soldier will be sent to hell. We're providing them with free one-way tickets to hell. So they're doing eye for an eye now. Every Iranian soldier that is killed, an American soldier will be killed, which, again, if that was going on up until this point, there would be thousands of American soldiers dead. So this is a major shift in force posture for the IRGC, and I assume it is an attempt to slow down American strikes on their members of their militias and IRGC and Artesh. But at the same time, I think it's also just an objective escalation where they seem to be very precise so far. I mean, they've been extremely accurate in their salvos, where they launch 10, 8, 7 missiles at these places, and almost all the targets, at least 3, 4 touchdowns happen every time. They struck Amazon Web Services in Bahrain. They struck HIMARS in Kuwait. They struck Patriot missiles in Erbil, Iraqi Kurdistan. They've been striking troop barracks and major jet and helicopter hangars in Jordan across all of these places. Targets in the UAE obviously have been struck consistently before with precision accuracy. So that we're also going to discuss apparently some CIA sites that over the past few weeks and months have been revealed to have been targeted by the Iranians, potentially even with the aid of the Russians. And of course, the Chinese are supposedly helping as well. Trump's denying this. We're going to get into all of this, so much more later on in this episode. But one of the other big pieces of news is that at the request of the United States, Europe is delaying the release of Sentinel-2 satellite imagery from the Gulf of Oman to cover up the impacts of Iranian strikes. So it shows you how effective these recent Iranian strikes have been. Of course, again, Israel wanting to get involved would be a major escalation. None of these precision strikes have struck Israel recently. So once that starts, the Israelis realize that there's shortages in Patriot missile interceptors, THAAD missile interceptors. This is going to pose a major problem for them. So of course, on the one hand, they're like, oh, we only want to join the war if it's going to be scorched earth, which appears to be the most likely option as of right now with Trump's disposition, what he's leaning towards, and the options on the table as Iran not only controls the Strait of Hormuz, but is pushing the Houthis to further shut down the Bab El Mandeb Straits more than they already have, which we'll discuss in a second as well. It's clear that the scorched earth, total targeting of civilian infrastructure, and even potentially escalating to the nuclear option appears to be on the table, and what Trump is considering more strongly than other options. And of course, Israel would be happy to assist in all of this. But with the lack of these interceptors, again, another Patriot missile defense system was destroyed in Erbil in Iraq. And these are the outer layers of the Israeli layering defense system. You have Iraq and the Gulf states, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. These are the first layer of defense. You then have Jordan, Syria. These are sort of the next layer of defense that Israel wants. And then you have, the Iron Dome and David Sling over and THAADs in Israel itself. And those have all been depleted to the point now where Iran is, 50-50 likely if a missile is going to hit its target in Israel. And that's extremely bad for Israel's security situation. And that's why even Bezalel Smotrich is a little bit hesitant, I think, to re-enter the war because the Iranians have them scared. So with all of that in mind, Dmitry, what are you thinking? Do you think Trump is going to go all the way? Do you think we're going to see some kind of major operation? I mean, if he's going to go all the way, he's probably going to strike Pickaxe Mountain, strike all of the other sites, strike Tehran, and move on the coast, particularly Karg Island, I would say, and some of these other places, and potentially get something going up on the Kurdish border. If you're really going to go all in with the Israelis and all of that, that's probably what you're going to do. Or do you think there's a chance he might just do the Pickaxe Mountain Midnight Hammer Part 2 symbolic strike? Because to me, I think everyone knows that would once again just be kicking the can down the road. So I'm curious your thoughts on what Trump's escalation this week is going to be, because as far as I'm concerned, I think the point of no return is we are very much on the brink of that.
We certainly are, and of course Trump's signaling, as well as a lot of the mainstream media publications across the West, including, for example, the UK's Guardian, are basically releasing these news stories this week. And this is how you can tell that there's a massive foreshadowing coming when they begin to explain to the regular normies, the goyim, who are not aware of these big targets, right, which Trump will definitely announce during a press conference that the strikes have been successful on, in the coming hours following the strikes themselves, just like during Operation Epic Fury. It'll be very cinematic. But Guardian, for example, publishes a story such as, what is Pickaxe Mountain? Where is it located? North of Isfahan, south of Natanz. And they kind of describe it to the regular folk as in the land far away, there's this evil underground base like a G.I. Joe Cobra hideout that needs to be taken out. And this is what Donald J. Trump will be doing along with the valiant Israelis. And it's just completely insane. We don't even know if the previous nuclear bases were destroyed during Operation Epic Fury. Right? There's still very scarce evidence as to what exactly happened to the nuclear enriched materials. There's conflicting reports. There's clearly a lack of nuclear radiation in the vicinity if they were all blown up, or if a portion was damaged. There is no sort of international oversight. However, what is international oversight worth anyway in 2026 if we really ask that question post October 7th or even post special military operation start date? So in any case, Donald J. Trump is clearly attempting to push some sort of massive PRW, most likely, and Conrad, as per usual, like it will probably happen in the coming days, maybe even this weekend, or perhaps following weekend, after 2 weeks of basically targeted bombing of the Iranian coastline for the most part. Again, we discussed this last week as to the recent targets have been essentially those myriad Iranian bases and basically drone and ballistic missile locations located on the south side of Iran along the coast, essentially, especially around the islands related to the Straits of Hormuz and basically Iran's locking down of that very key strategic location. But we just have to keep in mind, obviously, Iran's leadership is well and truly in Tehran. And look, it has been a little while since Iranian leader blood has been spilt, right? So it's been exactly, I believe, over 4 months since the murder and assassination of Ali Laranjani, the strategic Iranian leader who, again, this was a massive loss, but the man was entirely courageous and fearless in his conduct. He was walking out in public in early 2026. It was completely, basically, almost indifferent to the fact that, the two most predatory regimes in the world, Israel and the US, wanted his head, and he, of course, in the Shia Iranian fashion, was killed as a warrior, sort of standing on duty. And since that particular assassination, there hasn't been really any beheading strikes by the US and Israel. So perhaps, Conrad, just as we discussed Pickaxe Mountain and possibly some B-1 bombers, which, by the way, this week there were a lot of basically B-1 bomber reports that they were taking off from Fairford Airport, which is located in the UK. So you just imagine in Misty Albion, they have these big black planes, basically US bombers that can carry thousands of kilograms, thousands of kilograms of payload, taking off, flying across all of Europe for the entire Mediterranean, flying overhead over Israel through either Jordan or Syria, and that is the southern point of Syria where it touches Jordan, and then through the territory of Iraq into Iran and conducting those bombing raids. Usually they would fly in pairs, and this has been happening this week. There are reports that, during prior bombing raids, there have been some B-2s as well flying from Diego Garcia, which is located in the Indian Ocean, so to the south of Iran. So basically two distinct locations. You can kind of see the long-range these long-range US bombers are actually located quite far from Iran. And we saw this obviously last year in Operation Spiderweb, where Ukraine basically conducted these sabotage drone attacks on Russian long-range bombers, which were located on airports, deep in Siberia and deep on the Arctic Circle. So essentially, the US actually understands that Iran, without hesitation, if it had access to those B-2 and B-1 bombers located at any airport in the GCC or Arab states, would absolutely bomb them, just as they're doing right now with US strategic arms depots and radar systems. For example, as you said, Conrad, earlier, the myriad of attacks that was conducted on US assets across the Middle East basically turns this into a very costly conflict for America, especially some of its troops, as well as all of the investments that it's been doing into these Israel-allied asset countries over the past few decades, since probably the conclusion and commencement of the Iraq War of 2003, when, of course, Saddam Hussein was taken out, who himself was an enemy of Iran at the time. But you just have to keep in mind, so there were THAAD missile radars taken out. Obviously, Patriot radars, again, are probably a prime targets for Iran. Iran is trying to make sure that the Arab countries essentially all but stand down when the major attacks on Israel no doubt recommence, because Israel itself has really shown no quarter in Lebanon. So as soon as if another Israeli provocation takes place, so Iran basically wants to say that the Arab states will need to allow it to bomb Israel indiscriminately, whichever military targets they choose in Natanz, Tel Aviv, Haifa. But at the moment, Conrad, we are facing basically a fresh Trump administration Pete Hegseth provocation. When Pete Hegseth says Pickaxe Mountain is reachable, and this is, by the way, a site very deep in Iran. This is between two of the largest cities in Iran, Isfahan, the old imperial Iranian capital located south of Tehran, right basically in the center, very far from the Strait of Hormuz as well, like over 800, 900 kilometers away. So these are targets like very far away from any sort of leverage commercial trade positions. They have no relationship. This is a dismantling strike on basically Iran's long-term strategic capabilities for nuclear enrichment, basically. And we know that as far as we're concerned, there is still a fatwa that is a Shia Muslim ban on the development of nuclear weapons. But this hasn't really deterred the Trump administration on these provocative actions in the past. So I think, Conrad, we may be seeing basically a combination of potential strikes against Iran, maybe to try and discombobulate, no pun intended, to confuse the Iranian leadership, to basically scatter their attention. We may see strikes on desalination plants along the coast of the Straits of Hormuz, basically depopulating those zones, causing massive refugee crises within Iran, forcing the local Iranian native people to leave Keshem Island, leave some of these islands which don't really have access to large supplies of fresh water, and especially the coastal regions. And once they're depopulated, it'll be a lot easier to then conduct a ground operation. Perhaps these two things will happen simultaneously or in several phases. At the same time, there may be new decapitation strikes on targets, which the US has more or less has probably planned and has tried to acquire over the last 3 to 4 months, because no doubt since the assassination of Ali Laranjani, there's definitely been some targeting. We know Mossad spies have existed within Iran, and no doubt CIA spies as well. They've probably been working on particular targets through their safe houses located within Iran, which particular, government minister works where does he sleep, where are his apartment buildings. We know that during last year's 12-day war, there was a pinpoint accurate murder of basically a whole slew and series of Iranian nuclear scientists in their own home apartments. So no doubt they do have certain targets, but they do need a green light from the Trump administration to carry out those murders. And yes, it's unfortunate that the US regime has basically turned into this murderous assassin regime, which basically will carry out these attacks in basically, we can almost say, broad daylight for the whole world to see, and for the embarrassment, I guess, of American Christians first and foremost, because no one wants to really die for Talmudic Judaism, but Trump, I think, is going to force the issues. And no doubt about that, Conrad, Pickaxe Mountain as another big WWE PR win for Trump is something that's somewhat necessary, especially since people may begin questioning as to, is it really worth it? Brent crude is approaching $100 per barrel, $100 per barrel. There's all these concerns about the long-term ramifications. Bab El Mandeb is experiencing some issues, so there does require, Trump is required to carry out some sort of victorious progression in this war. And I think Pickaxe Mountain is going to be a big symbolic victory for him if he manages to bomb it with GBU 57s or GBU even 72s. But of course, 57s are those 12,000 kilogram explosives which have to be dropped by those B2, basically X-Men style bombers that will take off from Diego Garcia. And if that does happen, I think it will also point us towards Iran's capability of actually defending its skies, especially across central Iran, with modern-day air defense systems, because those B-2 bombers are stealth bombers. They do fly incredibly high. Notice how they fly over the territory of Israel, southern Syria, basically over territory which Hezbollah has some sort of approach to with their long-range missiles, but Hezbollah is not even able to target the B-1 bombers. But the B-2 bombers specifically, if they do fly over this territory of Iran and they aren't threatened at all, this will say a lot about exactly how effective U.S. bombing of Iranian surface-to-air missile capabilities and their radar systems has been over the last 2 weeks. Really, all the cards will be on the table at that point.
No, most definitely. And the Israelis are pushing for Trump to strike Pickaxe Mountain, obviously, in their mind, as part of a much broader plan. And of course, in his recent meeting this past week with Joseph Ayoun, president of Lebanon, he openly said that he will soon strike Pickaxe Mountain, not if, but when. People asked him again if he would do that, and he sort of walked it back, but he still said basically that it is most likely happening. But from Middle East Spectator here, it says, Israel believes that Iran moved not only its advanced centrifuges, but also part of its stockpile of highly enriched uranium to the underground facility deep beneath Pickaxe Mountain after last year's 12-day war. So that is the Israeli perspective, which is just what they thus want to happen. Of course, Pickaxe Mountain, the base is beneath, I think, 450 feet of granite. So again, even the B-2 dropped, high-level bunker-busting 27,000-pound bombs that were used in Operation Midnight Hammer. Some don't even know if it would fully destroy the site at Pickaxe Mountain, even with multiple direct hit detonations. So who knows? And then who knows if it's even there? Who knows if this is just Israel wanting to destroy any potential site where Iran could do this? I really have no idea. Iran is a massive mountainous country with almost 100 million people. The idea that they couldn't figure out places to hide things is a bit ridiculous. But I think in many ways you mentioned the targeting of you mentioned, of course, Pete Hegseth saying that in front of Congress that a lot of our capabilities are classified, but if anybody in the world can reach anything on God's green earth, it's the U.S. military. That's what he said about being asked if we were even capable of targeting Pickaxe Mountain, which, again, he didn't leave out the nuclear option. So, again, some people say that if they don't think that those big bunker busters will do it, they'll drop some kind of tactical nuclear entity on Pickaxe Mountain. And if they're going to go for the total war ground operation model, maybe that's how they'd start. Nuke Pickaxe Mountain. That would be quite the way to begin an operation like that. But of course, you mentioned the strikes on the nuclear scientists, the strikes on Ali Larijani. We wonder, since the MOU has been destroyed, the Americans have not really engaged in any of these assassination strikes. And Israeli media is reporting that IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi and IRGC Aerospace Forces Commander Majid Musavi are at the top of Israel's assassination target list. I would assume that would also include the new head of the IRGC Navy, who's running their fast boat operations, but not quite as relevant to Israel, more relevant to the U.S. goals. But those are probably the three most desired targets right now in Iran. And the U.S. clearly, obviously, is trying to keep negotiations going, so they're not going to engage in these assassinations. But that the moment Israel gets involved, that will be the targets. And perhaps that was another reason why Iran issued that statement that we mentioned earlier, that every Iranian soldier that is martyred, an American soldier, will be sent to hell. Well, what happens if an IRGC general is martyred? Does that mean that an American admiral or an American general or an Israeli general or an Israeli politician will also be killed? I'm sure if they decided to interpret it that way, they could, because that's still basic eye for an eye. So maybe that's one reason why people are hesitating, because the Iranians have made it clear with how precise their recent strikes have been on Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraqi Kurdistan, Jordan in particular, that those could be decision-making centers in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, or even in CENTCOM bases in Saudi Arabia, or on aircraft carriers or other decision-making ships where CENTCOM major officers and admirals are operating. So that could be another reason for the hesitation on the part of Zog. But moving on to the Strait of Hormuz, of course, as we speak, an Omani diplomatic delegation has traveled to Tehran to discuss mechanisms for managing the ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. So that is clearly the Omanis are still trying to play both sides, working with the Americans to have a toll-free route, but also collaborating with the Iranians on the joint management. but the Iranians have made it clear that they're willing to completely box the Omanis out, control the entire strait themselves, and mine every path except the current safe path between Syrski and Keshem Islands, where people pay their toll or at least get permission from the Iranians to make it through. I believe many Chinese vessels are not being made to pay the toll as we speak. According to the Lloyd's Market Association, they published a new model clause for use by marine hull underwriters addressing the position of fees while transiting straits. Under the clause, insurers will not cover any such payment. In addition, where a payment has been made, cover for the relevant vessel will cease due to the risk of a breach of sanctions and or terrorism legislation in the US, UK, or EU. So they're saying that you will immediately lose your shipping insurance on your tanker if that tanker pays the Iranian toll to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. So there are basically no insured ships that are going to be able to do that. So the blockade on the Iranians and their closure of the Strait of Hormuz just got somewhat tighter, because even those brave ships that are willing to make the passage are ostensibly not going to be insured if they're not willing to pay the toll, or they're going to have to brave IRGC fire and strikes. And of course, the Houthis have partially closed down the Bab El Mandeb. At this point, like 10 to 12 ships have been turned away. The Saudi ships have been forced to go through the Suez Canal. Many ships have still made it through the Bab El Mandeb Straits, so we don't, know the exact numbers. It's not that they've officially closed it to everybody. The Iranians are still saying that they hold that card. So I think they're still waiting for the exact moment when to really lock all of that in. But Trump, of course, has said that he will target Yemen's Houthis if more tankers are targeted in the Red Sea. This was yesterday, July 23rd. President Trump said in a post on Truth Social on Thursday he would target Yemen's Houthis, officially known as Ansar Allah, and inflict military punishment on Iran if more tankers are targeted in the Red Sea. A year ago, the United States of America attacked very powerfully the Houthis for their interference with commerce and trade by shooting at ships. Since that time and during our conflict with Iran, they have acted very responsibly. Unfortunately, now they are starting up again, shooting at 2 Saudi Arabian ships last night. Please let this truth serve to represent that if they do this again, the U.S. will hold Iran responsible, and that the Houthis are a surrogate and or proxy of Iran, and major military punishment will be inflicted upon Iran and, of course, the Houthis themselves, who I'm very disappointed with, in that they have until now acted very professionally and smart. Of course, the bombing campaign against the Houthis that Trump underwent resulted in, if people remember, it led to the agreement where the Houthis would allow American ships to pass through, but would keep striking Israel. So if that's what behaving well means, then, good for them. But clearly Trump is afraid of the what will, of course, happen if the Bab El Mandeb is completely closed. He's trying to get the Iranians to tell the Houthis not to do that. That's what, of course, he means by those strikes. But the situation with oil and the Strait of Hormuz and all of this is getting more and more dire by the day. This is from CIG here. It says the oil crisis is now considerably more dangerous than it was back in March, while market sentiment remains complacent. This is from a text from Alexander Stachel on X. It says the Strait of Hormuz is closed again with less dark fleet shuttling than 10 days ago. Iranian crude exports have been effectively blockaded. It's by the U.S. The Bab El Mandeb has become a new front in the Iran-U.S. conflict, removing additional Saudi barrels, less diplomatic room to maneuver than before the MOU. Kazakh crude exports via CPC terminals halted following Ukraine's vessel strike campaign in the Black Sea. 1.5 million barrels per day of Russian product exports are missing, with significant duration due to low recurring Ukrainian drone strikes. Global crude inventories are 1.5 billion barrels lower than on the February 28th, which is when the Purim War began. U.S. product inventories remain low while its refinery system is maxed out. Brent back to $6 front max backwardation. Of course, we discussed how it's almost at $100 per barrel. We're rapidly moving from a product crisis, which is here to stay, back into a crude and product crisis. Expect fresh announcements of Strategic Petroleum Reserve releases, but we've discussed how the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is lower than it's ever been since the late 70s. So the situation with the oil market is very dire. We discussed last week how many elders are saying that basically, 6 to 7 weeks from now, early September, we are going to see major shortages in America and major escalations in general in World War III around the world. In fact, apparently Elder Gabriel of Mount Athos, a prominent spiritual child of St. Paisios, recently said that come September, no one will even be able to make it to the holy mountain, Mount Athos. So we'll discuss that a little bit more in a second. But this energy crisis and these slowly being fulfilled prophecies and these escalations are really coming to a head here. And again, speaking of this oil situation, Pakistan and Qatar are, of course, some of the major negotiators behind the Memorandum of Understanding. But apparently the Pakistan Army chief leveraged private oil ventures with the IRGC heads to shield Saudi Arabia. This is from CIG as well, citing the Times of Israel. After Iran launched missiles at Saudi Arabia the first time in months, Asim Munir warned Ahmad Vahidi that it jeopardized their joint company transporting oil from Iran to Pakistan. Pakistani military chief Asim Munir leveraged a joint oil transport venture with Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps chief Ahmad Vahidi to secure an agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia under which Tehran agreed to halt attacks against the Gulf Kingdom. 3 officials familiar with the matter told the Times of Israel this week. The agreement, mediated by Munir, was struck in late March while the U.S.-Israeli war against Iran was still in its early weeks. A Middle East diplomat, a Middle Eastern intelligence official, and a third official familiar with the matter told the Times of Israel on condition of anonymity after coming under repeated Iranian fire during the first month of the war. Along with other countries in the region, Saudi Arabia went largely unscathed after the deal was inked, according to the 3 officials. To mediate the agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Munir dangled the continued operation of a joint venture with Vahidi that has been quietly transporting oil from Iran to Pakistan since late last year. The company, tied to both military generals, has paid massive dividends for the pair, particularly during the ongoing U.S. blockade of Iranian ports. So they're implying, of course, this is all, private corruption, I guess, on both sides. Who knows if that's just Israeli injecting that narrative into this, but clearly the Pakistanis are operating largely on behalf of the Saudis. They, of course, have that joint defense pact, and I think the Pakistanis very much don't want to invoke that in defense of Saudi Arabia against Iran. So that is one of the updates. However, I don't think Iran currently trusts Pakistan quite as much as a negotiator as they did before. Again, these Saudi tankers and these others continue to be turned away in the Bab El Mandeb Straits. But of course, the Kazakhstan oil export problem is apparently at least as big as that of Gulf producers Iraq, Kuwait, and Qatar at the moment. Around 80% of Kazakh crude exports depend on the CPC route, which passes through Russia, ending in the port of Novorossiysk, while alternative corridors can absorb only a fraction of its roughly 1.7 billion barrels per day flow. So again, the Ukrainian blockade against Russia in the Black Sea is dramatically affecting Kazakh crude exports, which is a major exporter. We're going to discuss the Russian blockade on Odessa in a second. But again, so many blockades, so many strait closures, so many ships being turned away and being not insured that, again, the idea that a crisis wouldn't occur in a few weeks' time, 40 days or so, is becoming less and less likely. It seems that this is, unfortunately, the inevitable future of the world economy and the energy situation. But, of course, Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, they have this close alliance. Pakistan is one of the only nuclear-armed Muslim state. And, of course, Saudi Arabia is now in the crosshairs, I guess, as a potential new civilian nuclear entity. We actually just had an announcement from Trump, and many people were surprised by this. So this is, again, in the midst of a war with Iran because they're believed to be pursuing a nuclear program discreetly. Trump has now said that if they join the Abraham Accords, Saudi Arabia will get a civilian nuclear program. Initially, they said that he might even do it without normalization, but of course, I'm sure Israel stepped in. But this is from antiwar.com. It says President Trump on Thursday said that the nuclear agreement the U.S. and Saudi Arabia signed on Thursday will only move forward if Saudi Arabia normalizes relations with Israel, a statement that came after backlash from Israeli officials over the deal. Trump also said the deal won't involve nuclear enrichment, though U.S. officials have said it could lead to uranium enrichment on Saudi soil, and that it would be non-military, citing Iran's nuclear program as an example, appearing to acknowledge the fact that Tehran doesn't have a nuclear weapons program. The civil nuclear deal, there will be no enrichment of material being made between the United States Department of Energy and Saudi Arabia, which pertains only to non-military use, such as the ones that Iran and the UAE and others already have, will be approved, but is totally subject to Saudi Arabia joining the very respected and successful Abraham Accords, the president wrote on social media. The United States is not opposed to civil non-enriched nuclear facilities, Trump added, appearing to conflate uranium enrichment with weapons proliferation, despite the fact that several countries have an enrichment program and no nuclear weapons, including close U.S. allies Germany and Japan. There was no sign on Wednesday when the U.S. Energy Department announced the U.S.-Saudi nuclear deal that it hinged on Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords, and Saudi officials have maintained that the kingdom won't normalize relations with Israel until there's a path toward a Palestinian state. But today, Friday, July 24th, Trump made it very clear that Saudi Arabia would be needing to join the Abraham Accords if they are going to be getting any kind of nuclear deals. So, Dmitry, I'd love your thoughts on this deal with Saudi Arabia, the nuclear situation, the Pakistan-Saudi situation, but most importantly, the Bab El Mandeb, Strait of Hormuz closures, and the coming energy crunch.
No, I think Iran has a very realistic outlook on, the negotiation status and basically the roles of Oman, Qatar, Pakistan, and basically how all these players act and which particular countries they may even represent. For example, Qatar very clearly allied with Turkey, very clearly like Muslim Brotherhood based, which is not the same as the Iranian Shia Revolutionary Front or that particular movement, very much in support perhaps of like quasi-Wahhabi, Salafi movements in the Middle East, which again would have been in conflict with the Iranian militias and basically Iranian allies for quite a while now, and specifically Iran's greatest ally that basically allowed for these strikes in the first place. Qatar was behind, of course, the beheading of the Assad family in Syria in late 2024. So I think Iran is very clearly aware of all of these connections, and they're very, Abbas Araghchi, the foreign minister of Iran, is specifically in response, basically calls most of the US's calls for a ceasefire and basically short-term peace or some sort of coming to a negotiating table as greedy, basically selfish perspectives of the US, which basically just seek to dominate Iranian geopolitical interests, at least in the short term, to try and control the situation, which Iran well and truly has the reins of, at least in some limited capacity at this point, because their ballistic and drone strikes across all these US military targets has basically been successful at this point. They've struck all of their key objectives at this point, and they've made announcements basically confirming that as well. It's really interesting as well that the Houthis have answered basically the call of Iran, and just as Trump is basically on the brink of striking the civilian targets within Iran, already making those announcements. And I do have to say, striking civilian targets can be construed as a war crime. I think officially, according to wartime legislation and basically the norms of international law, it can be very clearly put out that Trump has already announced himself de facto a war criminal by stating that he's going to terrorize the civilian population of Iran that have nothing to do with the IRGC or the military, essentially forcing them into some sort of submission if they continue to, again, pay their taxes or do whatever the Iranian regular people are, doing, going to their 9-to-5 jobs and just living their lives. They will have to suffer because of Israel and Trump's ambition over what needs to happen to the regime in their country specifically. So it's very, very evil, the ideas there. But Ansar Allah and the Houthis answering the call, I think it's quite interesting how their approach to the Bab El Mandeb Strait, Conrad, at the moment is in a very limited capacity attempting to show the world what may happen when a true blockade breaks out. And again, there were 2 Chinese ships that made it through on the 23rd of July. And most likely when you're listening to this show, there's many more ships that have basically sailed through the Red Sea into the Gulf of Aden and the reverse, and up the Red Sea into the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean. So at the moment, the blockade of Bab El Mandeb has not really commenced in full force yet, but Saudi ships have in fact been targeted by the Ansar Allah Houthis, and Saudi Arabia has retaliated by bombing the port city, held by the Houthis, Hodeidah, located on the Red Sea coast, opposite of Eritrea. The really interesting aspect of all of this is Trump's comments, where he basically stated this week, Conrad, that that China and Russia need to be dissuaded from providing any intelligence or weapons to Iran and its allies. And that's quite curious because Djibouti, located very close to basically on the outside point on the Gulf of Aden, has a Chinese base located there very close to the Yemenis Houthis, and it's unclear necessarily what the Chinese radar ship is doing as well in the Sea of Arabia. Near Oman, there is a Russian corvette, Stoiky, still located next to the coast of Oman as well. So there are Russian and Chinese potentially intelligence assets located around this location, and Trump is essentially signaling that, look, there shouldn't be any interference in our conduct of the war and the conduct of our allies. And this is quite curious. Clearly, Trump's involvement as well in the Saudi Arabia energy issue is, in a way, a jab at the Russian Federation, which has basically led the expansion on nuclear civilian technology across the entire Middle East and basically all of Asia as well, including Central Asia, specifically through their company Rosatom, which we discussed on several episodes. It's the only Russian major publicly governed corporation within the Russian Federation that as of yet has not been sanctioned. So nuclear civilian technology, Russia is a leader in, and essentially the US trying to take Saudi Arabia off the market and basically blocking them off from the Russian Federation in a way is a stab at Russia's interests in the GCC states, which frankly put has been very curious. It's not been exactly the most pro-Iranian position. We've spoken about the plans of selling the S-400 systems that Turkey has, those 2 surface-to-air missile launchers, these massive trucks with and basically anti-air missile launchers on the back, to the United Arab Emirates. That's still sort of a project in the works by Turkey. It hasn't, I believe, been approved by the Russian Federation yet. The Russian Federation has these strange bilateral agreements with the United Arab Emirates. Putin has these like almost personal relations with Qatar, the UAE, these very strange corporations. And of course, Saudi Arabia has been somewhat kind to Russia. I believe early in 2026, there was this visa regime announced of Saudi Arabia to make it easy for Saudi Arabian travelers and businessmen to conduct, their commercial dealings with the Russian Federation. So the Russian relations with the GCC states is very much different to how you would imagine it, given Russia's allyship with Iran, who, these countries are essentially an enemy of at this point. So it's not exactly clear cut in essence, but I believe there is some interest here that the US is trying to isolate the GCC states from basically conducting its own geopolitical projects separate from that of Israel, and getting the Saudis and the GCC states heavily involved with the Abraham Accords will essentially almost put them on a guaranteed path of collision with Iran, and a collision potentially with Turkey in the near future. Essentially, if you consider, the aspirations of the Abraham Accords, normalization of Israel, potentially Israel's expansion into some of those other territories located in the Middle East, Greater Israel Project, and what the Abraham Accords may have in store in the near future, who knows, being pushed by Jared Kushner and friends. So the Trump project, I think, Conrad, is multifaceted at this point, and it's at the same time an attack on Iran as well as a move to isolate Russia away from the GCC states, trying to push it away and saying that, look, no, the US civilian nuclear industry will move in and it's going to take over. You don't have to rely on the Russian Federation for these things. And, Russia is an ally of Iran, and look, Iran and the Houthis, they're all friends, and they're targeting GCC states. So potentially it's a Trump administration sort of multifaceted approach here. But again, it's this sort of cunning plan I don't think will have many fruits in the long term, but we'll just have to see exactly how the Houthi and the Saudi situation breaks down, and what the signaling will be from China and Russia. Because at this point, China and Russia well and truly have called on Iran as well as its allies to come to the negotiating table, which really hasn't been a entirely, shall we say, a red-pilled pragmatic approach to the whole situation. They haven't necessarily seen the reality of the matter, the fact that there are these terrorist strikes on the Iranian civilian population almost every day. There's been Iranian casualties. 2 people, for example, just in the last 24 hours have died in Khuzestan, and 11 others were injured. So there's constantly the outcomes of the US bombings are leading to the deaths of innocent Iranians. Some of them have nothing to do with the IRGC. It's just their particular locations at the time of the US bombing of the coastlines or the southwestern provinces of Iran. And there seems to be no particular strong response from China and Russia at this point. So Trump's threats may in fact be somewhat effective in this regard.
Obviously, Trump today is claiming that Iran or rather China and Russia are not helping the Iranians. But from Reuters, we saw just the past few days, it says here at least 2 CIA sites were struck in March, the CIA station in Riyadh and a separate site in eastern Iraq. Some of the sources said additional CIA sites have been hit, but they declined to disclose the exact number of locations hit by Iranian drones. One source put the number at more than 1 and fewer than a dozen. The second source said several facilities were hit. So again, up to 11, I guess, CIA sites or other less prominent targets the Iranians apparently have been striking since March. These were not disclosed, of course, to the media and other public disclosures. And of course, just this past week, this was on Thursday, July 23rd, a reporter asked Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, is Russia helping Iran target U.S. troops? To which he responded, nice hairstyle. So again, he didn't deny it, but he may also have just been not taking that specific reporter seriously. But in the midst of all of this, Trump posted on Truth Social, he said, President Xi at our recent meeting in Beijing, China, told me that he would not under any circumstances give or sell weapons to the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that statement included Chinese companies. Considering our relationship, I take him at his word. And besides, I'm doing him very big favors. Also, likewise, President Putin, despite the horrible war going on in Ukraine, the relationship remains as it does with President Zelensky, told me that he would not sell weapons to Iran. He understands that I do not sell weapons to Ukraine, but to NATO countries, we pay full price, and how those countries weapons are distributed, I have no idea. Therefore, 2 major countries that people speak of, often in terms of Iran, are, in my opinion, not participating. If they did, it would be very bad for them. Certainly not in their best interests. Thank you for your attention to this matter. But again, it's already been pretty clear that the Chinese at least have lended certain satellite capabilities to the Iranians for targeting, and potentially that's the Russians have done that as well. They're like, oh, we're not giving the weapons, they're just giving them extremely important intelligence, of course, that allows them to strike these major targets. So the situation with those strikes is obviously a bit shrouded in mystery, but I think it's clear that some kind of sharing is occurring between these superpowers and Iran. And as we were recording this, of course, Iranian ballistic missiles have been impacting Patriot interceptors, and other sites, U.S. CENTCOM sites in Bahrain, as well as Iraqi Kurdistan. So the war continues. We are in the midst of World War III here, sheltered beneath hundreds of feet of granite here in the World War Now bunker as the war rages around above us. But of course, the situation in and around Palestine is still escalating, even though Israel hasn't been struck either by Hezbollah or by Iran here in a few weeks. They have used the opportunity, again, any kind of peace, they immediately start to use to expand their immediate borders. And of course, this is from AA from Turkey here. It says, the Israeli army forces killed 3 Palestinians, including a minor, on Thursday and withheld their bodies in the northern West Bank amid ongoing assaults in the occupied territory, the health ministry said. In a statement, the ministry said it was informed by the General Authority of Civil Affairs, the official liaison body between Israel and the Palestinian Authority, that Mahmoud Hussein Abu Samra, age 20, Mohammed Samer Miletat, age 16, were killed by Israeli fire in the town of Beit Farik, east of Nablus. It said a 24-year-old man was also shot and killed by Israeli forces near Hadad roundabout, east of Jenin. The official news agency Wafa, citing security forces, said early Thursday that Israeli forces shot and killed 2 Palestinians and withheld their bodies in Beit Farik. 2 other Palestinians were injured by Israeli fire and transferred to a hospital for medical attention. Beit Farik Mayor Youssef Hanani and Israeli forces shut all entry points to the town as soldiers and occupiers attacked residents while they were trying to extinguish fires that broke out in their fields. Hanani and Israeli troops forced a Palestinian family to evacuate its home after assaulting its owner, while fires spread to electricity poles, and occupiers set fire to 2 Palestinian vehicles in the town. Dozens of residents were unable to reach their homes or leave the town after the Israeli army closed the Beit Farik military checkpoint. The killings came shortly after the Israeli army shot dead a Palestinian in the northwest bank in claims of carrying out a stabbing against targeting one of its soldiers near the illegal settlement of Ghanim. I believe 2 IDF soldiers also ended up being killed in the midst of a struggle. I think someone managed to wrestle a weapon away from one of the soldiers in the midst of the kerfuffle to try to get to the bodies of these young people. So very unfortunate development in Palestine. This, of course, comes as Ben Gvir and other Israeli ministers gathered at the border with Gaza to call for the resurrection of 3 new Jewish settlements that, of course, were evacuated in 2005 when Hamas came to power in Gaza. It was put on by the settler group Nachala, which is led by Daniela Weiss, who has long advocated Israel resettle Gaza. Speaking at a Likud party conference, she said Palestinians would disappear from the territory. So that is the current state of things when it comes to Palestine. And of course, Greater Israel is also expanding in the north. And despite the ceasefire agreement with Hezbollah and these pilot zones, that apparently one of these pilot zones where Israel is supposed to pull out of and the Lebanese army are supposed to enter into on the pretext that eventually they will be using those as starting points to disarm Hezbollah. One of those pilot zones has been put into effect, but in violation of the Lebanon-Israel Framework Agreement, Israeli ground forces are currently advancing to the summit of Balawil Hill, south of the town of Barachit, in the Bint Jebel direction in southern Lebanon, and this is beyond any territory that Israel has ever occupied in years and years and years. So this is another complete expansion beyond, and it's clear these pilot zones were probably areas that Israel was not particularly concerned with anyway. So, Dmitry, I'd love your thoughts on the current situation in Palestine, the current situation in Lebanon, and what else you think is coming in this region and how this might affect the situation. I don't know if the Iranians will step in if things get too gruesome. Of course, in Lebanon, we know they will, but maybe even Palestine.
It's very clear, I think, Conrad, since the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003, there's been this new role that Iran has taken up upon itself to be the main defender of the Palestinian innocent people. And look, this is something the Arab states and the GCC states have basically conceded on almost entirely. I mean, the Abraham Accords is like the last bit, and of course the acceptance of the state of Israel, normalization of Israel, is sort of the last stretch of the way the GCC states have to go before committing sort of the sin of Judas against their own kin and co-religionists in Palestine, essentially against their own blood relatives, their own blood relatives in sort of the Arab Palestinians that live in the occupied Holy Land. So it is really curious how the Iranians are most likely the ones, and of course the Ansar Allah and the Houthis, their allies in Yemen, are most likely the ones who are going to respond to more bloodshed in Gaza, in the West Bank, when Israel commits these provocational strikes. And just like we talk about quite a bit, Conrad, in relation to the upcoming midterms in the US and what will happen at the end of October and early November, and how Trump's plans may essentially relate to this, and what will essentially come after the midterms. Will this be a gloves-off moment for the Trump administration? We also need to consider the upcoming Israeli Knesset elections coming up in October of 2026. And this will be absolutely massive because Netanyahu's prime ministership, the operations of Likud, the left and the right wing in Israel have very different opinions on how, shall we say, domestic policy at the very least should be conducted. Israel does have this quasi-schizophrenic division within itself. And specifically, I do want to point out, and in relation to Georgescu's election that was stolen in December of 2024 in Romania, just as a comparison, the Bagatz, the Supreme Court of Israel, is very left-wing. So they're very much anti-Netanyahu. And Netanyahu's Likud constitutional group, basically a constitutional committee, has essentially given Netanyahu a green light to say, in case of an emergency, look, you may need to suspend the election in October of 2026. And we know what might take place. An emergency could be internal, could be related to what so-called Palestinian terrorists, Palestinian insurgencies, black swan events. It could be Hezbollah bombing of the Knesset, something crazy like this, or an entirely, basically, fictional, burning of the Reichstag, so to speak, colloquially speaking, provocation that will take place. A new 9/11, new sort of dancing Israeli scenario that will happen within Israel to prevent the Netanyahu government from losing certain seats or perhaps potentially losing the entire election. You do know Netanyahu at the moment is standing essentially on the brink of being criminally tried, and there are these letters that Donald J. Trump over the last 12 months has written to the president of Israel, which is largely a symbolic role essentially to give Netanyahu immunity. And so these processes where the left wing in Israel is trying to hunt down Netanyahu and place all the blame of the genocide on him, essentially use him as a scapegoat, as a goat. They'll be released into the desert and sacrificed, sort of eaten alive by the demons which they themselves unleashed, is well and truly still a scenario they may play out. And of course, people like Ben Gvir most likely will not be punished, or Bezalel Smotrich, but Netanyahu will receive all the blame. And essentially Israel's inbuilt aggression and Zionism can be blamed on this one particular prime ministerial figure. And it's quite curious how Israel's expansion nevertheless continues just in every direction imaginable, except, of course, that of the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. So Israel doesn't go against the strongest neighbor. It again targets the weak, the more or less these non-state actors such as Hezbollah, Gaza, West Bank, powers which really cannot defend themselves against the very powerful Israeli Air Force. And there are continued war crimes. In a way, it's almost as if Israel, with these actions in the West Bank, Conrad, is attempting to provoke Ansarullah and Iran to escalate, so that then the Trump administration will have an excuse to go, as you said earlier, to approach the entire Iranian situation with a scorched earth approach. How dare they target the innocent Israelis and the Jews, these evil anti-Semitic Iranians, not understanding that the Persian Iranians are probably the most philo-Semitic people in the entire Middle East. Speaking about this, going back historically, they even Ruhollah Khomeini, when he came to power, he said, do not have any pogroms in Iran, do not touch the synagogues, etc. So in terms of Talmudic Judaism, Iran is completely in favor of that. In fact, it's protective of Talmudic Judaism. However, it's very truly against Zionism. And this is something that Israel just simply cannot accept. It needs to be, Zionism is something that needs to be completely open to an open ideology that needs to be accepted by the entire Middle East, which is something that the GCC states appears have, been pushed almost to the brink of accepting, which is quite ashamed for them. And it's really curious how, figures like Joseph Aoun and Nawaf Salam, the Prime Minister of Lebanon, and respectively the President himself, they're traveling around the entire Middle East and now to America, essentially trying to broker some sort of organized plan of Israel's extraction out of Lebanon. But it doesn't seem like anyone's really budging, because Israel's position in the Middle East is so cemented, and everyone understands the Netanyahu regime is so predatory in the way it's going to conduct itself and the excuses it's going to use. I mean, this sort of really Talmudic, lawyerly approach to the entire argument that we are conducting an anti-terrorist operation in the south of Lebanon. It's a somewhat of a strong argument that, again, Turkey has used in the north of Syria against ISIS, against PKK and the Kurds. The US has used the same argument against Cartel de los Solos and the alleged drug dealers in Venezuela, and etc. And the same approach is being now used against the RGC, which is a designated terrorist organization, and again, their allies and Ansar Allah, etc. So Israel is well and truly using every avenue it can get in order to secure as much territory as possible in the south of Lebanon, create this new buffer zone, and we don't see really any of the BRICS world powers having any pushback against Israel's presence in Lebanon. So it's not somewhat surprising that Joseph Aoun, Nawaf Salam aren't really achieving anything. Lebanon, unfortunately, is one of those countries which, as it stands right now, has no natural allies, except, of course, Iran, which the government in Lebanon is really unwilling to accept, given maybe their religious backgrounds or their already pre-subscribed ideas about Shia Islam, for example. So Joseph Aoun, Nawaf Salam will never accept Iran's assistance, and they'll continue to reject Hezbollah, whilst that may be the only key to their sovereignty in the mid to long term. So Joseph Aoun, as well as Nawaf Salam and some of these other power brokers representing the respective Catholic Christianity and other Christian sects in Lebanon, as well as Sunni Islam, are basically stuck between a rock and a hard place, between the hammer and the anvil. And in this case, I think Israel is the hammer, and it's going to continue killing innocent Lebanese civilians until, of course, they can call on one of the larger countries to step in and essentially try to, force Israel out of their nation. And that one country, again, as we speculated many times, could in fact be the Turkish Republic, led by Erdogan, which is why I think the entire situation and the escalation against Erdogan by both Greece, which is heavily, again, allied with Israel, unfortunately, and the Israeli rhetoric against Erdogan has been so powerful, because they somewhat understand that the only country that can ruin their immediate plans of expansion into Syria and Lebanon may be that northern former Ottoman imperial remnant, which could also have some sort of real estate geopolitical aspirations onto their former Eastern Mediterranean coastal territories.
No, undoubtedly. And the Eastern Mediterranean, obviously, Israel is distracted dealing with Iran right now, but they're continually vying for influence there between Turkey trying to be the two most influential powers. Of course, the Hellenic world is entirely sidelined with Greece and Cyprus as these indebted EU, NATO subservient states. Of course, Egypt is there as well, but Egypt and Turkey have sort of settled a lot of their differences in the midst of all of the things going on in Palestine. The two sides, of course, are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause in a lot of ways, even though both Turkey and Egypt obviously recognize Israel. The situation, of course, between Israel, Greece, and Cyprus, the alliance, unfortunately, is growing. And of course, Israeli defense systems, this is from Straturka, a Turkish strategic outlet. It says Israeli defense systems in Greece to monitor Turkey. Israel's advanced defense systems that are about to be sold to Greece will be the Israeli army's eyes monitoring Turkey from a few kilometers away, says Turkish analyst. There's a major deal being put forward between Greece and Turkey to be supplied with air defense systems, sort of, again, just like Jordan, the Gulf countries, and these other states act as Israel's outer, sort of Iron Dome defense towards the east. Greece and Cyprus are going to be that same defense towards the west to defend them from Turkey and to defend them against, I don't know, a anti-Semitic Europe or something like this. And in response to this, Ankara in Turkey, they've proposed to rename the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus as the Cyprus Turkish Republic. This is a bold proposal, was just introduced on the floor of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey. Drop the northern name and rename the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus to the Cyprus Turkish Republic. By removing northern, the proposal aims to assert a state identity, claiming the entire island is a major diplomatic shift unfolding in the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, European affairs analyst Yanis Koutsomitis on Greek news recently, he said, Turkey is a threat to Greek sovereignty, and Greece is aligning with Israel to build an airspace infrastructure against regional threats. So again, think about all of this in the context of the fall of Erdogan, of the prophecies of the saints that say that once Erdogan falls, there will trigger this crisis that will lead to Turkey attacking Greece, taking these Greek islands, closing the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, which will then trigger the Russian invasion. And if you think about this in the context of what Erdogan is doing, of course, recently people were speculating on Erdogan's health. A lot of Turkish netizens have been inquiring that he hasn't been seen in public in a long time and that his health is declining. But a big announcement, I discussed this on my stream this week, Libya has been selected by the African Union to host the 2026 Africa-Turkey Summit, following successful diplomatic efforts by Presidential Council head Mohamed Menfi during the 38th African Union Summit in Addis Ababa. The decision is framed as renewed international recognition of Libya's role in African affairs and its capacity to support strategic cooperation between Africa and key partners. Hosting the summit is seen as part of Libya's push to restore its continental leadership in economic, political, and development initiatives. The African Union also noted Libya's historic contribution to Africa-Turkey relations, which have previously produced three major partnership summits in 2008, 2014, and 2021, and two ministerial conferences in 2011 and 2018. The fourth Turkish-Africa Partnership Summit is scheduled to take place in Libya in 2026, but no specific dates have been publicly confirmed yet. And those previous three partnerships, Africa-Turkey relation partnerships in 2008, 2014, and 2021, were all attended by Erdogan. So in theory, if Erdogan doesn't attend, it could be an indicator that his health is declining. And if he does attend, well, we do know that many elders have said that Erdogan's plane could be shot down, specifically flying back from either Syria or Libya. So keeping all of this in mind, with Israel's new plans to basically incorporate Greece and Cyprus likely into their broader Iron Dome Greater Israel protection system, we have to realize that that could be exactly how these systems are going to, these prophecies and these events are going to play out. And of course, we're recording this on July 24th, the day after July 23rd, of course, when the E65 highway was completed. This is from Holy Wisdom here. It says the E65 motorway, one of Greece's key national road infrastructure projects, will be completed in full with the opening of its final section between Kalombaka and Grevena on Thursday, July 23rd, 2026. Of course, here, according to Ekathemerini, which is a Greek economic outlet, it says Greece has completed a long-delayed motorway linking central Greece with the country's northwestern regions, cutting travel times between Lamia and Ignatia Odos Highway near Grevena to about 1 hour and 45 minutes. The opening of the final 46-kilometer section of the central Greece motorway, known as the E65, brings the entire 182.1-kilometer route into operation, creating a faster road connection between Athens, Thessaly, and Western Macedonia. The new section runs from Kalombaka to the Ignatia Odos and expected to significantly improve access to Grevena, Kozani, Florina, and Kastoria. Of course, the motorway's completion marks the end of one of Greece's most protracted infrastructure projects, originally expected to take about 3 years. Construction lasted 18 years due to delays and technical and financial complications. The project ultimately cost the Greek state and European Union about $2.1 billion, more than 4 times the initial estimate. And of course, it connects with other European highways that connect down through the Balkans all the way up to Poland's North Sea coast. But of course, here it says the official inauguration will be attended by the Prime Minister and the political leadership of the Ministry of Infrastructure and Transport. I haven't been able to find any evidence of that, so maybe Mitsotakis skipped out on this. But here are the prophecies relating to this road. It says here in 2011, Father Panayotis Siolis was traveling with one of his godchildren, George Bouzikas, along the treacherous Lamia Domoku road, widely regarded as one of the most dangerous routes in Greece due to its frequent and often fatal traffic accidents. Then suddenly the elder turned to George and asked, "George, if there was a war, where do you have to show up?" George said, "The army paper mentions Evros." He says, "You're not going to show up at Evros. You're going to Rio. You're going to wear a cross, and there you'll be tasked with telling the residents to go up to the mountains to the right of Navpaktos, because NATO troops will come through and ravage everything they find along the way." George then asked the elder when the war would take place. And he said, "George, the war will break out when the new road connecting Domoku to Lamia is completed. Then there will be a great famine in Greece. It won't last long. And then we will go to the city, Vasifuleusa, known as the Queen City." The astonishing part is that just 10 days after that conversation, George received a new army paper stating that in the event of conscription, he would no longer report to Evros but to Rio, just as the elder of Agrafa had foretold. And now the E65 road is completed and officially inaugurated, meaning the war is close. May the Lord have mercy. And people remember, we discussed this on the show last week, Theotokos appeared to several people in Cyprus, telling them to prepare, that the Turks would be leaving Cyprus soon. And Elder Ephraim of Arizona and Philotheo appeared to one of his spiritual children on Mount Athos and said, to prepare, the events are coming. So it couldn't be any clearer. We are on the precipice of these events. Again, just listen to the first hour of the show. Geopolitically, we said we were on the precipice of the point of no return, and it seems the prophecies are lining up with this perfectly. Panayotis Siolis, Father Panayotis, has been dead for many, many years. So again, the fact that he would somehow exactly predict when this road, which had been delayed for 18 years, would be officially completed, again, it proves that this is fundamentally prophetic, noetic vision and not just, the ramblings of certain geopolitically interested clerics. But Dmitry, I'd love your thoughts on all of this as we then transition into discussing everything going on in Russia and Ukraine as The front line slowly but surely continues to expand in Russia's favor, and more interestingly, the ports of Odessa and the Russian ports on the Black Sea are effectively being totally blockaded by both sides, which those who have been listening to the show for a very long time, they almost don't need us to fill in the details on how, based on all the prophecies I just read out, how a blockade on the Black Sea could lead to, the U.S. could be asking Turkey to, after Erdogan falls, if Russia is fully blockading Ukraine, you could see the Americans being like, you need to completely close the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits to Russians. If they're going to blockade Ukraine, then we're going to totally blockade them. So I'd love your thoughts on everything I just discussed, Dmitry, and you can take us into the Russia-Ukraine front as well.
No, it is very interesting that the port closest to Turkey, I would say geographically closest to Istanbul, and in the right in the corner, the southwestern corner of Ukraine, is the one that Russia has targeted essentially some of the commercial storage facilities located in the port. So Russia has, in fact, struck it with drones, missiles, and certain port facilities are very heavily disabled. The blockade that's currently like a de facto blockade on the ports in Odessa are not officially announced by the Russian Federation. There isn't like the same sort of announcement like we saw in the Straits of Hormuz, but the Russian Federation isn't basically shooting down Ukrainian ships in the Black Sea itself. That really hasn't taken place. However, Ukraine is doing the same in the Sea of Azov and has already fired at multiple Russian civil commercial vessels in the Black Sea. So in fact, the Russian approach is not necessarily equaling that of the Ukrainian terroristic approach of basically targeting civilian vessels at this point. But that massive port, the Chernomorsk port, as I said, the most southwestern port, is well and truly blockaded now. And this is quite curious. The entirety of the Odessa Oblast has three major ports, so basically 3/5 of all of Ukraine's maritime export does leave from the Odessa Oblast. So if you look, I suppose, from the southwest all the way to the northeast, you do have the Chernomorsk port, then you have the Odessa port, and further up, closer to Mikolaev, close to the Dnieper River, you do have the Yuzhny port as well, which the Ukrainians have renamed recently to something silly, but in any case, the Yuzhny port appears to be perhaps the most protected one at this point, given its proximity to Kiev and some of those central Ukrainian territories. But the Chernomorsk port well and truly is very strongly disabled, and in fact, there has been some reports from the Ukrainian Secretariat for Entrepreneurs in the cabinets of ministers, Zablovsky. He said that, monthly foreign currency earnings from agricultural exports apparently are going to fall or have already fallen by $900 million per month. So Ukraine is receiving less income. Now, Ukraine was already heavily in debt at this point, but apparently he said this is not a big deal. He says, look, grain prices in Ukraine, are going to fall by about 1/3, and they have fallen over 1/3 over the last few days. And he says we have to expect this to remain the course, a 33% reduction in grain prices in Ukraine. But he says that, look, the collapse of the Ukrainian economy is unlikely because agricultural export losses are relatively small, a small monetary input compared to the scale of Western financial assistance. So he's basically saying, screw our, forgive my French, don't worry about our local economic interests and our national industry of exporting agricultural goods. We have money coming in from NATO, EU countries, from America, and some of our allies in the West. So it's just complete Talmudic creditization going on here. And the Ukrainian cabinet of ministers basically is completely behind this messaging. So they're saying, look, it's a shame that Russia is blockading and targeting some of our port infrastructure. Again, Russia's claiming that these are retaliations, essentially trying to sober up the Ukrainians in an attempt to stop them from targeting Russian civilian facilities in the Sea of Azov and on the Black Sea coast, etc. But Ukraine is not really waking up to these threats. And in fact, there's been a new escalation in this entire conflict. As we said, plenty of possible Black Swan events taking place in the Black Sea related to Turkey, but of course within European Russia as well. Anywhere west of the Ural Mountains, there are just clear targets. And this is quite unfortunate news because once it, again, sort of hit, I really couldn't believe it at first because these are essentially almost unprecedented levels of escalations by the Ukrainians, targeting almost exclusively civilian facilities. And on the 18th of July, so basically last Saturday, we saw 2 warehouses struck. So these are massive, almost Costco-like Amazon warehouses belonging to a Russian major corporation called Wildberries. So this is the Russian equivalent of Amazon. Of course, that Wildberries and Ozon are the main 2 commercial distributors within the Russian Federation. There are over, by the way, 120 of these big warehouses across Russia, but this is just the beginning. So this week there's been an official Ukrainian drone bombing of these warehouses located all around European Russia, but even in deep oblasts. And the two warehouses struck last Saturday were the Elektrostal, located in the Moscow region, so fairly close to the Ukrainian front line. Just where you discussed distance, but from the Ukrainian border where one of these drones could be fired, it's closer to the Moskovskaya Oblast than, for example, the Strait of Hormuz is to Tehran. So, relatively speaking, these Ukrainian drones and the drone pilots themselves have already trained how to fly these drones. And of course, many of them get shot down. The vast majority, 90%, 95% of these drones get shot down. But of course, those that do make it can cause these massive fires and explosions that chain react across the warehouses, killing, injuring civilians, etc., within Russia. And the other warehouse that was struck on the 18th of July was in the Tambovskaya Oblast, which is located, again, just a bit to the east. So again, they're targeting these sort of long-distance targets. And furthermore, one in Krasnodarsky Krai, one in Staropolsky Krai. And just yesterday, there were the strikes on the Leningradskaya Oblast. So up north, next to St. Petersburg, there was two warehouses that were struck and one warehouse that was struck on the Crimean Peninsula in Simferopol. So very concerning. The Ukrainians are essentially still attempting to, the Ukrainian leadership is trying to suffocate Crimea, which is at the moment still experiencing fuel shortages from the issues surrounding the Ukrainian strikes on petroleum logistics across Russia, military and civilian alike. And there are these claims that we're going to try and cause civil unrest within Russia, but as even reported by, a Talmudic journalist within Russia, he's a foreign agent, Venediktov, a very well-known journalist within Russia, probably one of the most renowned. He covered many of the terrorist crises in the early 2000s across the Russian Federation, but he is of the Talmudic extraction. Even he commented that, look, these Ukrainian strikes on civilian targets, all they're going to do is enrage the Russian population against the Ukrainians. Like the average Russian Gen Xer or boomer is just going to say, President Putin, can you just bomb these Ukrainians harder? Can you kill Zelensky? Because he's targeting, my AirPods and my earphones are not coming in on time because the warehouse has been taken down. So in fact, the Russian consumer, the Russian normies are only going to be agitated at the Ukrainians for complicating their lives rather than being upset at, for example, President Putin and United Russia for starting the war in the first place. The annoyance is going to fall on the perpetrators of these terror strikes. There is, of course, a small aspect of, these Wildberry warehouses providing some military support to the Russian army. And yes, they do sell certain cables or certain parts, but they would amount to less than 1%. Less than 1% of the items located in these warehouses would even go towards some, you can say, some very fringe military purposes. So to strike at these warehouses is to, for example, kill any sort of civilian in Russia and claim, well, they are paying taxes towards the Russian regime, which is then carrying out attacks on the Ukrainian state. Therefore, the civilian needs to die. It's something like very distant like that. You cannot make these arguments. So Ukraine, in a way, has escalated the fight, and people are calling, well, within Russia itself, people are calling for retaliation strikes, and unfortunately not against Zelensky or necessarily against the decision makers within Ukraine. They're saying, well, we'll have to play a tit for tat game, similar to how Iran and the US respectively were both taking out civilian commercial vessels in the Straits of Hormuz, which have sort of unproven military capabilities, and most likely they're just vessels trying to traverse the Straits of Hormuz without certain permission from one or the other side. You have the Russians are calling on Russia the Russian government to strike against the Ukrainian equivalent of Wildberries, for example, Rozetka, which is like the Ukrainian Amazon distributor. But, I mean, what is the purpose of striking at Ukrainian warehouses and trying to target civilian targets when, in fact, you can actually hit military targets within Ukraine? Again, the purposes of these are quite unknown. It is very clear that within Ukraine, I think Zelensky's goals are essentially to demoralize the Russian public as much as possible. And there is constant rumors circulating within the Russian Federation of potential upcoming mobilization as well. And I say this as the Russian Federation is achieving its ends, moving closer and closer towards the three major Donetsk People's Republic city is still occupied by the Ukrainians. So Druzhkovka, Kramatorsk, and Slavyansk. So as the Russians are approaching, there's these rumors circulating that potentially the Ministry of Defense within the Russian Federation is going to commence a new wave of bringing in reservists into military action, maybe mobilize certain people with higher tertiary educations to join the drone forces, which are currently heavily understaffed. We discussed in previous weeks how the Russian production of drones is at the moment at such a high capacity, just as the Ukrainian drone production line is, that there actually aren't even enough pilots to actually operate these drones at an efficient rate to fly them into the enemy. And so, in fact, there are more drones than there are pilots of drones. And unfortunately, as Andrei Belousov recently mentioned during a press conference this week to Russian military journalists, he did say that Russia is currently hiring more and more drone pilots, especially young people who want to join the military but perhaps don't want to be on the front lines or in the trenches shooting at the enemy. They're always welcome to join these drone forces. And so that's probably the shortage. And who knows, if there will be a mobilization in the Russian Federation, it won't be, for example, a World War II or Vietnam-style draft. It'll be are you good at playing video games with a remote controller, because we're going to need you to learn how to fly a drone in short order and essentially operate in these particular forces, which may or may not be safer. Again, the defensive facilities where these drone operators are training at, or even fly their drones from, are prime targets for missiles from both sides, respectively. So it's not necessarily an entirely safe role to play in a modern military sense, not as it was maybe 5 or 6 years back. But it is really curious. The other thing Andrei Belousov, the defense minister of the Russian Federation, did give us an update about is that he says that by November of 2026, the Russian Federation will be rolling out new anti-drone technology. There will be a way of dealing with drones. Is he referring to the Black Sea Navy? Is he referring to some sort of electromagnetic weaponry that the Russian Federation will distribute? Potentially, and I think it could be both of those things. Maybe the Black Sea Navy, as we've speculated, will come online. Perhaps maybe these strikes on the Chernomorski port and the quasi-blockade that Russia has set up, over Ukraine, is potentially a foreshadowing of an escalation in the Black Sea. The Russian Black Sea Navy will emerge after almost 2 years of being essentially out of action, repairing itself, renovating itself, and with some new outstanding technology against drone attacks and drone swarms from the Ukrainians, which no doubt will be flying at those Russian ships as soon as they leave their respective defensive harbors. The Russian Navy can cause some damage, maybe even take on some new targets and territories within the southern or southwestern portions of Ukraine. Who knows exactly? The Mikolaev, Kherson, Odessa ports are prime targets for any Russian amphibian operation, just as the US, no doubt, is looking to drop off that 101st or 82nd Airborne Division onto the southern point of Iran sometime in the future. So in fact, both military superpowers in the world are looking to conduct similar military sort of coastal operations sometime in the near future. So we are on the lookout for that. It'll be a very interesting comparison if both military operations take place in the year of 2026 during this Third World War. And the other thing I wanted to mention very quickly, this is probably one of the biggest news stories, and again, coming in from the Ukrainian military shuffle, the firing of the commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Syrski. So we recall Zaluzhny was the commander of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, so the general-in-chief on the front lines at the beginning of the conflict. He was subsequently replaced by Syrski, who was, again, a Russian-born Ukrainian general, so a Ukrainian national, but definitely of Russian heritage. And Syrski was infamous for sending Ukrainians into basically meat grinder assaults in cities like Bakhmut and other cities, but he's basically the second most popular Ukrainian general after him, who was in charge of the defense of major Ukrainian locations such as Volchansk in the north and the Kharkovskaya Oblast, or, for example, Avdiivka in the Donetskaya Oblast, as well as he was in charge of Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, Mikhail Drapati. And Drapati has been named the new general, the chief in charge of the Ukrainian military. So at the moment, there is no standing Minister of Defense in Ukraine. Mikhailo Fyodorov has been still fired, and apparently, and he revealed in an interview, so Mikhailo Fyodorov, being a 35-year-old Minister of Defense, he's quite young, he's a millennial, he's going about giving all these, basically almost like leaking internal information, giving these weird press conferences. He's a very sort of tech-savvy guy, and he's very popular given, his sort of handsome looks and the fact that he speaks a very modern language within Ukraine. He is giving off these really big ideas. There's still protests, by the way, ongoing in cities like Kharkov, Odessa, and Kiev about his firing, but he's basically confirmed the very close involvement of the US military-industrial complex, and shall we say the tech bros with the Ukrainian industry. Like, we do understand, of course, that one of the tech bros, Elon Musk, was, of course, supplying and still continues to supply Ukraine with this heavy Starlink satellite support, without which I think Ukraine would have already most likely lost most of the territories located east of the Dnieper River. I think we can get pretty much 100% confirm that without Starlink connection, the Ukrainian military would, on many ends and many of these defensive locations, would have fallen apart by this point. But Elon Musk has been behind Ukraine this entire time, something which many geopolitical commentators really haven't spoken about, simply because, for whatever reason, Elon Musk's father is visiting Moscow and says he's interested in Orthodoxy or attends church services. But I'm sorry, but Elon Musk is supplying Ukraine with absolutely an immeasurable amount of logistical support and communications devices, which Russia at this point cannot even match. The fact that the Ukrainian war is going on is largely because of Elon Musk's support for the state of Zelensky in Ukraine, which people should not be discounting at all. But now it's been almost confirmed that by Mikhailo Fyodorov, the former defense minister of Ukraine, that Alex Karp, the Ashkenazi leader of Palantir, tried to hire him for a project managerial job in the US. So can you imagine the connections between the US tech bros and Ukraine, something which, again, is well and truly in the shadows, but it does appear that Palantir does have a finger in the pie of the Ukrainian military-industrial complex, the monetary exploitation of the Ukrainian people, and who knows what else is going on there. So it's just we know Palantir already works with Israel. Now we 100% know that Palantir also works with the Ukrainian military-industrial complex. So incredibly, incredibly concerning. But yes, the Ukrainian military now has a new leader, Mikhailo Drapati, and Drapati is a veteran of many frontline wars. He's recently, of course, lost in Pokrovsk, Mirnograd. He's lost in Avdiivka, and at the moment he's maybe slightly more popular than Syrski, but one of the interesting things about him is he is a born and bred Ukrainian, of course, born in the USSR, but specifically in the Ukrainian SSR. So he is from Khmelnytskaya Oblast, he grew up in Sumskaya Oblast and all these other places. So there's no, for example, attacks on him that can come from the fact that, well, this is just a Katsap, this is just a Vatnik Russian who converted to Ukrainianism. No, this is a born and raised Ukrainian, a man from his people, and he's going to be representing the Ukrainian military, apparently, which is completely subjugated itself to Western and Talmudic interests. So it's just very unfortunate. Nothing really is changing towards better, at least in the Ukrainian regime. And, even really already subversive figures like Laura Loomer, while traveling to Ukraine, sort of meeting with Zelensky, meeting with the chief rabbi of Ukraine, Rabbi Osman, and sort of signaling. And look, Laura Loomer was one of the critics many years ago of essentially the Banderite neo-Nazi movements within Ukraine. She's completely forgotten all of that. And so you can kind of see her as almost a representative of the Talmudic sphere of MAGA sort of standing behind Zelensky. And the current opinions within the Russian geopolitical sphere is that Trump, while he's hyperfixating on Iran and the GCC states, is basically giving Russia and Ukraine some time to essentially, and these are their words, to kill each other as much as possible, to then join in at the end and maybe propose some sort of peaceful solution, almost come in as a peacekeeping force after Iran has been subjugated and provide some sort of new ceasefire opportunities. So Laura Loomer most likely is just keeping up those networking connections with the Zelensky regime on behalf of MAGA. In a way, I would probably view her more like a mini Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner type. And again, she would fit the mold, I think, tribal-wise. So yeah, it's just really concerning that Ukraine and the Ukrainian people, I think those who haven't been drafted or murdered at this point, Conrad, by their own regime, are well and truly not waking up yet. There's no protests against Zelensky. And look, I just have to comment on this. The best example is Russia has been striking at these electrical power grids and stations across Ukraine. There's been multiple winters with no electricity in a lot of these apartment buildings, and many civilians have been suffering under these long-term bombardments and retaliation strikes by the Russian Federation, and yet the Ukrainian people are not coming out onto the streets and not overthrowing the Zelensky regime. Why exactly is Trump trying to achieve the same with the Iranian people, who are perhaps even more ideologically fixated on keeping Iran as sovereign as possible, and perhaps even more motivated than the Ukrainian people, whose state has existed for less of a time than this Iranian Islamic Republic? I mean, it's completely insane. So the Trump administration really just needs to zoom out and objectively look at exactly, the conduct of wars and what the strikes on certain facilities maybe that have to do with civilians, what kind of impact that really does have. But at the moment, yes, Zelensky and his regime has basically chosen the path of terrorism by striking the equivalent of Russian Amazon warehouses. And who knows, there hasn't really been an official Russian response yet. But the only positive remark I do want to say about the Russian sort of domestic situation is that the strikes against oil refineries in Russia have decreased over the last week and a half. So this is probably a good thing, and potentially because Russia has been positioning a lot of air defense units, especially utilizing some of those private air defense units, surface-to-air missiles to defend the oil refineries within especially the European part, the western parts of the Russian Federation, to protect them against Ukrainian drone attacks. So they've actually prioritized that, trying to sustain the oil distribution within Russia without the entire issue cascading into a further internal crisis. And we say all of this as the price of petroleum goods rises basically uncontrollably in the entire world, something which Russia will inevitably benefit from in the long term.
100%. And again, both Ukraine and Russia are succeeding in their successive blockades of one another. I mean, again, Russia has had to stop diesel exports because of the strikes domestically, and in general, a lot of their shadow fleet that does pass through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits is being targeted by these Ukrainian drones. This is from EA Daily, specific details about the Odessa strikes. It says here, as part of the blockade of the Black Sea ports of Ukraine, 4 more vessels involved in the interests of the armed forces of Ukraine were defeated. This is reported by the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation. It is noted that high-precision air-based weapons and shock UAVs were used. During the strikes, 2 tugboats were struck in the port of Mikolaev at the crossing by sea northeast of Zmeny Island and near the settlement of Zatoka. A bulk carrier, Type C vessel, and a cargo ship delivering military cargo to the port of Chernomorsk. And again, at this point, the amount of ships that have been struck, it's much more than just the ones reported in that report. It's clear that they're probably not only targeting Ukrainian weapons, they're targeting all sorts of goods being shipped into Ukraine. It says, in addition to infrastructure facilities of the logistics center where military cargo was stored were damaged in the port of Odessa, a military cargo warehouse and fuel tanks of the armed forces of Ukraine were also damaged in the port of Yuzhny. As reported by EA Daily, Russia will do everything to block the Ukrainian grain corridor on the Black Sea. This was stated at a press conference by the head of the Kiev regime, Vladimir Zelensky. According to Zelensky, a separate person will be thrown into this direction. And of course, in the midst of all of this, Politico is reporting that Russia is choking Ukraine's lifeline Black Sea export corridor. It says here, Russia is holding global food security hostage. Today, 0 vessels passed through Ukraine's Black Sea maritime corridor right at peak harvest. This is deliberate economic, humanitarian terror. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha said in an evening statement on Wednesday, just as Iran targeted energy routes in the Strait of Hormuz, Russia is now targeting global food markets in the Black Sea, millions of families across blah, 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 blah. The attacks forced shipping giant Maersk to stop operations at the Chernomorsk fishing port in Odessa region this week, redirecting cargo to Romania's Constanta port. Ukraine says it would still provide security, but the vessel owners decided to halt traffic due to heightened security threats. Previously, there had also been many hits on ships, but most of them concerned ships already docked in ports. Klimenko, head of the Black Sea and Baltic Strategic Research Monitoring Group, told Politico, vessel owners have halted operations, wanting to see how the situation unfolds, what new solutions Ukraine can find. Klimenko added, Russia's actions prompted Ukraine to request an urgent UN Security Council meeting for July 27th, urging all states to immediately demand that Moscow stop its attacks on freedom of navigation in the Black Sea. The attacks intensified after Ukraine conducted a series of successful strikes against Russian shadow fleet tankers in the Azov and Black Seas, forcing Russia to halt exports earlier this month. But it would be wrong to say that's a response because Russia never paused attacks on Ukraine's ports and cargo, blah, blah, blah. Russia's blockade of Ukrainian ports in 2022 strangled vital agricultural exports and helped drive global food prices more than 60% higher by March. But after Ukraine's Navy established a protected maritime corridor in the Black Sea, the country exported more than 168.9 million tons of cargo through it, including over 100 million tons of grain, much of it bound for countries in the global south, despite repeated Russian attacks on Odessa's ports. So the Black Sea has never been more of a war zone. Smoking ships dot the landscape. And of course, in the midst of all of this, obviously the strikes on ships are continuing in the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, just earlier this week, the U.S. struck an Iranian LNG tanker, killing 2 of the crew members, disabling it. So again, America is engaging in these same types of strikes. So it's never been a more dangerous time to be a crew member on one of these tankers. So I'd love your thoughts again on any other Black Sea escalations, Dmitry. Like I said, I really do believe that Russia will double down more on blockading Ukraine. NATO and America will request that Turkey blockade the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits to Russia. This will likely occur in and around the time that probably after Erdogan has already died or been assassinated by Israel. And basically, NATO and the Americans will allow Turkey to take many of these Greek islands in exchange for them closing the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits and violating the treaties that they have going into it and boxing out the Russians. So I'd love your thoughts on that, as well as apparently Kash Patel's upcoming visit to Russia. I can't imagine why the Russians are letting that jeet into the country. So I'd love your two thoughts there before we move on to a few other stories.
Well, yeah, no. Speaking of the Jeets, respectfully, the Russian Federation has received some petroleum assistance from India, and apparently the claims were that, look, we built your oil refineries in India during the Soviet Union and the early 2000s, so now you owe us, this support. So India has been supplying some sort of petroleum goods to Russia. Kazakhstan and Belarus have also been helping Russia in sort of overcoming this recent shortcoming. So Russia is well and truly creeping its way out of the petrol crisis and the diesel crisis that it has been placed into by the Ukrainian, basically unannounced strikes on its oil refineries over the last month and a half or so. So that's kind of on a good footing, and perhaps the escalation could well and truly die down. But I think a very possible scenario in the Black Sea, the Bosphorus Dardanelles Straits, could be, Conrad, that if the situation of Bab El Mandeb and Hormuz are exacerbated, there's obviously a shortage of fertilizer shipments around the world. The U.S. wants to, again, contain that crisis and basically stop the world from slipping into an economic downturning, which, again, people would blame on, like, Netanyahu, the Trump administration, and blame it on the globalist masters, which themselves are the architects of all of this. And they will basically request that Russia cease the blockade of any of the ports in Mikolaev, Kherson, Odessa oblasts, and request that Russia back off, whilst not commanding the Ukrainians to do the same. And Russia will retaliate by basically stating, by giving the US these conditions that, look, unless the Ukraine does X and Y and Z, we are not going to be stopping these targeting of military shipments into the ports of Odessa. And then the US again will pressure, Erdogan will pressure its NATO ally on the Bosphorus and Dardanelles to temporarily, maybe, look, it may even start from like a temporary closure of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles to Russian ships until the Russians come to some sort of common sense realization of their actions against the Ukraine. It could be something very small, which will escalate further and further, and again, bring Turkey into Russian displeasure sort of over the short to mid-term time frame. So I think potentially this is one of the scenarios that definitely could take place. I would also say, it's very clear that the U.S., in trying to sustain the Brent crude oil prices, has most likely, and this is Mikhail Shevchenko and other military analysts have said this within, or geopolitical analysts, I would say more correctly, have said this within Russia, that potentially they've actually commanded Zelensky to stop striking, specifically targeting oil refineries within Russia, in order to, again, make sure that Russia can export or recommence exporting as many petroleum goods as it can to the world market in order to keep the oil prices down as low as possible as the situation in the Middle East again exacerbates and sort of spirals out of control. So in a way, the US is trying to play two games whilst escalating in the Middle East, which will inevitably cause the oil prices to rise in the world. They don't want Ukraine to contribute to that crisis by attacking the Russian Federation's oil facilities. So, and unfortunately, again, Ukraine is this uncontrollable monster that the US and NATO has created. So, in fact, it's the question will arise, well, will the Ukraine actually listen to some of these calls for reasonable action? And the whole tit-for-tat game which the Russian Federation and Ukraine is playing will, I think, inevitably lead to this massive exchange in the Black Sea, which could, I think, in the foreseeable future, bring in the Turkish Republic, at least on the side of the US and on the side of Ukraine, which they've been in favor of the entire time. I just want to emphasize Turkey, folks were saying Turkey was neutral and Istanbul, Astana, and all these meetings. I'm sorry, but every single year on the anniversary of the alleged Crimean annexation by the Russian Federation, Turkey releases an official government statement where they say that Crimea was illegally taken by Russia in 2014. So, like, they've constantly, for 12 years now, have emphasized the fact that the Russians are in Crimea illegally. Turkey has all kinds of weird interests in the south of Russia. For example, the Crimean Tatars, they say they're protecting their interests. The whole Transnistria, Moldovan, Galgaz people, which Turkey also has an interest in. There are these Cherkessian aspirations in the southeastern corners of the Russian Federation. There's also these concerns, obviously, that go into more or less the Sunni Islamic terroristic realm, be it the attacks in Dagestan, which apparently took place with certain, there was certain Islamic Turkish figures involved. Again, maybe to have nothing to do with the Erdogan regime specifically, but the fact that some of these terror cells could have been operating out of Turkey, and we do know a lot of what happens in Chechnya, Ingushetia, Dagestan, that the FSB do shut down a lot of these cells. For whatever reason, a lot of these terrorists, they do come out of those southern Caucasus regions. So there's a lot of major concerns and a lot of issues that Russia and Turkey still have unresolved. And historically speaking, the two countries have been at peace for a long time, but this is only somewhat situational. I think it's been a fortunate almost 100 years of peace. But that's not to say that I think civilizationally speaking, things cannot again descend down the chain of conflict, which I think may happen very, very soon. And it could be, of course, Talmudically speaking, it could happen over simple things such as world trade and commerce. I think that would be appropriate in a world dominated by capitalism for the actions between Turkey and Russia to emerge out of Trump's concerns for world trade and the blockading of the ports. And specifically, look, Russia's watching how Iran is responding to Trump, and Iran is basically ignoring any of Trump's calls for so-called common sense, reasonable agreements. And Russia may actually do the same when Trump will call upon Vladimir Putin and Lavrov and other figures within Russia to stop the de facto blockading of the ports of Odessa and other places. Russia may simply tell Trump to get lost, and Trump's only recourse will potentially be to do a counter blockade of Russian commercial vessels in the ports of the Bosphorus Dardanelles, those particular straits, and the Russian ports in the Black Sea and the Azov Sea will be essentially disabled from the world markets, and this will inevitably lead to a Russian internal economic crisis, and Russia will need to prospectively act militarily. And this is the Third World War escalating to a whole new level, as we've discussed here many times. This is, again, philosophically speculative, but I think it's a very highly likely scenario coming into the future, something that even for, Defense Minister Igor Strelkov, former Defense Minister of Donetsk, has foreshadowed going into the past. And again, Russia has de facto already fought against Turkey in Syria throughout the Syrian civil war. So it already has happened in the past, and it may just occur in a different theater very, very soon.
100%. And again, Israel and Turkey are on this collision course, and Russia and Turkey are as well. And again, right, I mean, Turkey, for example, they are issuing signals to renew a push to connect this pipeline between northern Cyprus and Turkey, and so many Russian-Turkish pipeline connections exist. So there's a whole world of ways in which the energy crisis and World War III and these prophesied conflicts will all, I think, intersect and come about. But speaking again of World War III, we saw members of the Chinese Coast Guard and the Philippine Navy clash with oars and sticks near the LST-542 class tank landing ship, the BRP Sierra Madre, which was purposely beached in 1999 by the Philippine Navy on the disputed Second Thomas Shoal in the South China Sea. We saw Chinese Coast Guard and Philippine Navy, again, they hit each other with oars and sticks. Water cannons were deployed. So new World War III front has emerged, the oar wars. But again, the Filipinos, they use this grounded old ship as a sort of an operating base to confront the Chinese incursions into the South China Sea on the Second Thomas Shoal. But again, all of this comes amidst U.S. and Chinese respective weapons tests in the region, U.S. deals that have secured access to Indonesian airspace effectively at their leisure. And again, looking at all of this, or after, look at the Bab El Mandeb Straits, the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, and of course the Strait of Hormuz. Besides, some of those North Sea routes, the Panama Canal, the only other real major strait we've got is the Straits of Malacca, which of course is one of the most important straits to China for them receiving a lot of these energy exports. The Iranian ships that are able to hug the Iranian land border and immediately enter Pakistani waters to evade the U.S. blockade of Iranian ports, they all eventually go through the Straits of Malacca to send that crude oil to China. So many of these choke points are coming under threat, and eventually they may all, who knows what will happen in the Panama Canal if something happens there. But again, in the midst of American empire, Hegseth, was recently before a congressional hearing, and he said a failure to appropriate the new budget of $1.5 trillion for the Pentagon's fiscal year 2027 budget constitutes the greatest threat to U.S. national security. Hegseth, joined by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Dan Kane and Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins, appeared before the Senate Appropriations Committee on Tuesday to discuss the Trump administration's request for an additional $87.6 billion in supplemental spending. Obviously, they are trying to avert a government shutdown. But again, they are trying to get this massive $1.5 trillion military budget that the Pentagon wants, and they think they need this probably too. If we're going to expand World War III, that's something that's going to be needed. And in Congress this week, War Powers Act was passed. The House of Representatives, 4 Republicans joined all Democrats. Obviously, you had Thomas Massie, but then you also had Tom Barrett of Michigan, Warren Davidson of Ohio, and Brian Fitzpatrick of Pennsylvania joined the Democrats for a 214 to 208 vote to rein in Trump on the war in Iran. Of course, the Senate immediately rejected it, voting 49-47 to reject it. So Trump can continue to wage war as he sees fit. So that was the attempt at American separation of powers and checks and balances that, of course, failed. So with all of that, unless you have any other stories around the world regarding World War III, Dmitry, of course, the situation in Venezuela, over 5,000 have been confirmed dead in that earthquake. The IDF, for some reason, have been one of the heaviest presences on the ground, pulling people out of the rubble. I don't know if there's that many Sephardic Jews in Venezuela or what, but it seems very suspicious to me. But regardless, I think if you have any other stories, feel free to let us know. But then let's move on to some church news. If not, of course, the Pochayev Lavra is now under threat.
No, certainly. There's been, the Ukrainian Ministry of Culture, and this is, something that we've foreshadowed, Conrad, and we've unfortunately predicted for a very, very long time. I think since the first year of the podcast, first episodes, you can go back and listen to them. And sadly, the Pochayev Lavra, the 3 major monasteries across Ukraine. Ukraine naturally has hundreds of monasteries, but the 3 major monasteries, one located in the center of Ukraine, the oldest monastery, the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, already occupied by the Zelensky government. Already there are literally like rabbis and Protestant pastors and Lord knows who else in the Dormition Cathedral and other buildings. There's, of course, they've already had veterinary experts look at some of the relics of the saints in the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra and other things, and they've desecrated that Lavra. We've spoken about that. The major monastery in Kiev is well and truly occupied, and those 150 or so remaining monks there will soon be ousted from their essentially house arrest that they've been located in, because they've been announced as illegal squatters on monastery, Ministry of Culture territory, because they've turned it into a historic reserve of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, an inheritance of the Ukrainian people, when in fact it's not a UNESCO, like the entire idea of like, oh, this is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It doesn't belong to the world. It belongs to Christ. It belongs to the Orthodox Christian Church. We are not of this world. Stop giving anyways. It's completely insane that there isn't this major reaction to this particular conflict. It's as if it's equivalent to what if the Notre Dame de Paris was taken away from the Roman Catholics and simply handed over to the Louvre, some sort of administration in France or something of this sort. Again, turning the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra into this basically abomination structure that they've planned for a very long time. They are, of course, setting their eyes upon the most western, largest monastery. This monastery has been operational for around 450 years at this point, since the great Russian crisis of the time of troubles in the early 1600s, and it was established by, of course, as we mentioned on our episode that you should listen to with Father Peter here, is recently released, by Saints Amphilochius and Saint Job of Pochayev. There's a famous miracle-working Theotokos of the Pochayev Lavra, very, very famous. It's the Pochayev Lavra. We've mentioned this before. Let's just repeat ourselves. It was one of the most famous monasteries in Ukraine that was conducting large prayer services over mildly demonically possessed people. So they had these mass exorcisms and even private exorcisms by the elders of the Pochayev Lavra for many years since the fall of the Soviet Union. And you can find these services on YouTube. I don't recommend, from what I understand, it's not recommended that you watch exorcisms on video camera or any sort of recordings of exorcisms, at least in the Orthodox Christian understanding. But there were, you do see that footage there from the Pochayev Lavra. Specifically the icon of the Theotokos there does cause quite a reaction from demons, and it does appear that the Ukrainian Ministry of Culture is probably offended by the fact that there are these exorcisms being carried out in Western Ukraine, and that needs to be shut down. If you recall that really the anti-Semitic hieromonk that was recently in prison within the Russian Federation, Sergei Romanov. During the COVID crisis, he was anti-jab and anti-vaccine. He, for a very long time, lived at the Pachayev Lavra, and he was perhaps the most strongly anti-Semitic hieromonk and monastic, and now he's, of course, defrocked and suspended, and we don't need to go into those particular discussions, but inside of the Russian Federation, he's in prison for at least 17 years for what I believe are false allegations, and many others within Russia, especially from the right wing and conservatives, believe so as well. But he, for a long time, lived at the Pachayev Lavra and looked after that icon. So you can kind of see the Pachayev Lavra as this hub of conservatism of Western Ukraine, and that's what the Ukrainian government is aiming to shut down. And it's very unfortunate they finally set their eyes upon it. Conrad, you said this very correctly off air, I believe, today, early today, when we were preparing for this episode, that it is likely that the Svetogorsk Lavra in the east of Ukraine, the Russians are well and truly 10 kilometers away from taking it. It's located inside of a national park, and once the Russians do liberate the Svetogorsk Lavra, the eastmost largest monastery within Ukraine, the Ukrainians will want to, retaliate, spiritually speaking, against the Russian Federation by occupying this particular monastery. There's already a pretext, in a way, being given out that, well, the Pachayev Lavra monastery is actually, they recognize Patriarch Kirill. They're actually members of the Russian church, and it's completely insane. They have a complete misunderstanding of Orthodox Christian ecclesiology, of the autonomy of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, or even the relationship between the Moscow Patriarchate and the state of the Russian Federation, which, no doubt about it, Vladimir Putin himself, nor Medvedev, nor Mikhail Mishustin, or Sergei Shoigu, none of them consulted Patriarch Kirill before starting the special military operation. I can almost guarantee that. None of them gave the Metropolitan Onufriy a heads up that we're going to begin this massive operation that's going to essentially end up potentially putting your local church under immense pressure. None of that, of course, took place, and the evidence of that is the Prigozhin revolt, which took place, and even people say that's a psyop, but Patriarch Kirill issued a massive countrywide prayer in June of 2023, praying for all churches across Russia to pray for a cessation of, and for God to prevent a civil war from breaking out. So when these major political breakthroughs take place, and you believe Patriarch Kirill is behind them, or he's planning things with Putin, I don't think President Putin is keeping Patriarch Kirill in the know at all. I think even Metropolitan Tikhon Shevkunov, I don't think these people are told what for example, Bear Lazar and Putin and other figures within the Kremlin walls are actually conspiring or consulting about. I think there's a huge wall of separation. There's a compartmentalization within the most powerful figures within Russia, and unfortunately even those figures of the Orthodox Church, they don't have as much sway as the Ukrainians will tell us, and sort of speculate us and try to inform us that that's actually happening. So it's very sad that Pachayev Lavra is being targeted. I do think there's a lot we need to sort of pray about, but specifically that the Ukrainian state doesn't take out another male Orthodox monastic community located so far in Western Ukraine that has provided so much spiritual solace and prayer for the Ukrainian people and all people located there. It's a great place of pilgrimage. So very sad. And there's other unfortunate news out of Ukraine. And look, this footage is entirely fresh, literally released in the last 24 hours. There's a video of course, he is in civilian clothing, but a Ukrainian Orthodox priest, Archpriest John Kuzminsky, is being dragged into a van by the Tetsaka, basically getting kidnapped. There's about 5 or 6 Ukrainian, militarily dressed men dragging him by the arms and legs into the van. I think his Matushka or some other parishioners are trying to stop the entire action from taking place, and then, of course, they put him into the van. They sit on him. They completely detain him, and the van drives away with its door open. So, again, another kidnapping of an Orthodox priest. If this footage, of course, is confirmed that it's Father John in the video, that is entirely concerning. And look, it's just another strike. The Ukrainians, they don't care that it's being caught on camera. They will just commit these sort of anti-human actions, even against clergymen. It's also been confirmed that another archimandrite, so again, this is a higher rank in a way than a typical hieromonk. This is a monastic leader of a monastery, and in fact, he's actually one of the leaders of the Sumskaya seminary. So in the Sumskaya Oblast, which the Russians are fighting the Ukrainians in at the moment, Archimandrite Anthony Bondarenko was detained by the Ukrainian forces and recruited into action. He's a relatively young but incredibly educated Archimandrite priest. Just keep in mind, though, his own Bishop Eulogius, or I believe it's Metropolitan Eulogius of the city of Sumy, has recently come out in a very pro-Ukraine position and pro-Zelensky position. And now his like left-hand or right-hand man, perhaps the most learned archimandrite in his whole diocese, is kidnapped. And so Metropolitan Eulogius has been actually calling out for the Tetzakar, the recruiting office, to release his own priest. And look, this is how the tables turn. When you start dealing with the satanic regime, the regime does not care. Like, if you deal with the devil, like, the devil will also hurt you, will commit these crimes against your own flock. In this particular case, it's just absolutely. And look, this priest, Archimandrite Anthony, he may have even had pro-Ukrainian views, but just because he was of the right age, maybe in his mid-40s or early 50s, of course, he fit the sort of criteria, and he was kidnapped on the 19th of July. So this news is somewhat belated now, 6 days in, but in fact, and as you're listening to this, it's been a week, he still has not been released. And there's officially statements by the Sumy diocese to the Ukrainian government to have him released, and they, of course, do not care. So already the forced recruitment of clergy is well and truly sort of on the way. So there's absolutely, Conrad, I think, a huge escalation in the Ukrainian state sort of putting additional pressure on the church, whilst at the same time you do have these, again, I don't want to hyperemphasize this, but these crazed influencers traveling to Kiev, walking around the monastery grounds, almost treating it as if it's all a museum, whereas these churches were lived-in prayer spaces, places of pilgrimage. And I refer to, of course, Laura Luma visiting the Dormition Cathedral to Kiev Pechersklava, really not appreciating the fact that this cathedral is desecrated, taken from the Orthodox Christians inside of Kiev, and all of these church spaces which once were living, breathing places of prayer and pilgrimage and worship, and now, of course, completely, almost in a way, the place has been occupied and desecrated by the Ukrainian Zelensky regime. It's incredibly sad, and I think more stories about priests being kidnapped, pyromonks, archimandrites, etc., will continue to pour out of Ukraine as long as this war continues and is exacerbated. And as Ukraine strikes civilian targets, I think, in a geopolitical sense, inside of Russia, I mean, what will stop them necessarily from continuing to persecute the church under the pretext of their spiritual connection to Moscow and the Patriarch Kirill? I think, philosophically speaking, the Ukrainian regime justifies to itself all of these actions, and maybe from some sort of satanic, internal, Talmudic perspective, it's completely correct in doing so.
No, it's really awful what's happening. And another archpriest, Vasil Lisovyi, a cleric of the Khmelnytsky eparchy, was mobilized among the territorial defense forces of Ukraine. He was stopped on the morning of July 22nd, taken to the district TRC, where he underwent a military medical examination and was assigned to a combat unit. The eparchy called on state authorities to investigate the circumstances of his detention and ensure compliance with the Constitution of Ukraine. The eparchy also noted that military service involving the bearing of arms and the possible shedding of blood is fundamentally incompatible with the priesthood. Clergy and faithful were urged to intensify their prayers for a lawful resolution of the situation and for Father Vasil's return to the flock. As the UOJ reported, media outlets previously told the story of the mobilization of a UOC deacon with several children. So again, they're just targeting these guys that they're depopulating the more popular and beloved local canonical church by just mobilizing their people. And then out of Bulgaria, we had His Eminence Metropolitan Gabriel of Lovech of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church has cautioned Ukraine's 6th Administrative Court of Appeal in Kiev, which is hearing the case on the possible liquidation of the Kiev Metropolia of the UOC, that its decision will have an impact on the life of all local Orthodox churches and will carry a pan-Orthodox dimension. Metropolitan Gabriel writes in a letter that his position continues that maintained by the late Bulgarian patriarchs Maxim and Neophyte, who always defended and remained in communion solely and exclusively with the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church existing on the territory of Ukraine. The Metropolitan also draws on the Bulgarian Orthodox Church's own experience of schism between 1992 and 2004, which was overcome, he writes, through the joint efforts of the clergy and the faithful with the support of our sister Orthodox churches, through the determination of prudent and enlightened statesmen, as well as through the decision of the Bulgarian courts and the European Court of Human Rights. He notes that the Bulgarian Synod had once described that schism by stating the Bulgarian Orthodox Church is being crucified by ill-intentioned officials, ambitious schismatics, compliant magistrates, and short-sighted politicians. He stated that this experience gives grounds to say that the juridical destruction of the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church would constitute an irreparable act of harm against the Church of Christ, to which it belongs, and would be far more difficult to overcome than a schism. So again, Bulgarians now with Metropolitan Gabriel here, as well as Patriarch Danil, the new patriarch, have stood firm in favor of the canonical church. So that is the news this week. That is the church persecution updates. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Dmitry, I'll give you the last word before I do the plugs and send us off.
Thank you all for listening to this really packed episode. Every week there are immense updates from all around the world, and we really appreciate all the supporters, especially the patriots who are listening to me right now. If you listened until the end of the episode, you are a real one. Get in touch with us on Discord. Definitely get connected. Leave a comment if you have a question. We'll make sure to answer it, and stay in touch. Follow our X to, again, get the latest updates and maybe become involved further when you speak to us on Spaces and Discords and other connection points. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for making it here to the end of the episode. Please like the episode. The more likes, the more recommended we are to other people on Substack. So hit us with a like, leave a comment, regardless of what platform you're listening up, whether it's YouTube, X, Substack, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. There's comments on those platforms as well. So you can find us pretty much everywhere where podcasts can be found. Again, go to worldwarnow.co to get behind the paywall to listen to our episode this week with Father Peter here is all about preparing how your parish, your community, your household can prepare for the upcoming events prophesied, the Third World War, famines, fuel shortages, a whole host of other things, of course, which we talk about all the time here on World War Now. So it's really tying everything together. You, of course, get access to hundreds and hundreds of hours of other incredible Ether Hour content. Like Dmitry said, you also get access to private Discord chats on our Discord channel that everyone should be a part of. But if you get behind the paywall on Substack, you get access to chats that Dmitry and I are more active in more regularly. So check all of that out. Follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. Follow us on X at World War Now _. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. Again, you can find us on all of those other platforms that I mentioned before. Be sure to hit us with the like button as usual. And as always, you can support us at buymeacoffee.com/World War Now. One of the best ways to support us. And of course, use code WWN for 10% off at antelopehillpublishing.com. So again, thank you all so much for making it here to the end of the episode, and we will see you on the next one. God bless.